Welcome to the Academy for Christian Thought. This is our series on interviews. We have today Professor Max Stackhouse, Professor Emeritus of Theological Ethics from Princeton Theological Seminary. And today we're going to talk about creation and nature, an issue that he has written about in this book. Let me just show you a volume 2 of a book he edited, God and Globalization. They are now in 4 volumes, so do get to it. Welcome, Professor Stackhouse. And we have on iPhone from San Diego, Professor Ong of Bethel Seminary. First question, Professor Stackhouse, you spoke and you have written on creation, how creation is not nature. Would you care to expand on that, please?
Well, it's implicit in the terms. When you say that that's natural or something is part of nature, it seems to be fixed in nature. It seems to be fixed eternally. It has its own structure and its own order and its own dynamics of possible change, but it's usually the change is quite slow. But when you say it's creation, that means there's a creator that's not nature. And the idea of a creator that's above and beyond nature, and was when there was not nature, and will be when nature is no more, that's a quite different thought that Christians, Jews, and Muslims, and some monotheists of other stripes all share. The idea of a supreme God who created heaven and earth. Furthermore, according to the Christian doctrine, we were commanded to take responsibility for the transformation of nature, till the fields, and cultivate the earth, and care for God's creation, and have dominion over it. Now, dominion can have several meanings.
I was coming to that, yes.
One is domination, and there's no doubt about the fact that wherever the possibility has been there, sinful humans have tried to dominate nature and turn it into something that is their own making. It's including idols and something that they think they can worship, that they create by themselves. But if we know something about the word dominus, from which dominion is taken, it means Lord. And if we think we know something about the Lord, then we have to take loving care for the transformation of that for which we're in our custodialship, our stewardship. Oh, by the way, do you happen to know where the word stewardship came from?
No.
It has to do with the Greek word oikonomia. And when they were trying to translate the Bible into English for the first time, they looked around for a word and they didn't have the word. They couldn't think of it. And finally, Wycliffe decided that there is a practice that was in England at the time he was living, in which they would choose the most responsible person
To be a steward.
to be a steward. And the steward was the sty warden, the warden of the sty that would keep the cattle, keep the pigs through the winter so that they could slaughter them in the spring and they would have enough meat to get through the next crop. And he was the one who would caretake the wealth of the village, the wealth of the establishment, for the sake of the whole.
So he was a trusted servant.
He was a trusted servant. That's what a steward is.
I see.
Trust or that which doesn't belong to you.
Now that changes the whole dynamics of how we understand dominance, doesn't it?
It does.
Because we tend to think of dominance as we
Manipulate
having control over other things, and therefore we can use it to our advantage, regardless of the consequences.
Well, the biblical view has it that we are to exercise dominion under the watchful eyes of God and try to be God-like in the way in which we do this. That is to say, we do it to heal nature where it's broken. We try to improve it where it's where it's faulty or incomplete. And that's what God tries to do with human life and with the created universe generally.
I see. Andre, any comments on this?
Yes, I wanted to push this a little bit further. The Catholics have a theological expression that grace perfects nature, or it is at least perfecting of nature, or moves it in that direction. So, could you explain how these leading central theological categories, such as creation, providence, and salvation, contributes to this new social reality?
Okay, Andre, you're asking about you're referring to the Roman Catholic teaching about how grace perfects nature, yeah? And your question for Professor Stackhouse is, how does that play into the traditional idea of the various doctrines we have? As you mentioned, doctrine of creation, doctrine of providence, doctrine of salvation. And you wanted Professor Stackhouse to comment on this, whether his reading of how creation and nature comports with the Catholic reading of grace perfecting nature.
Well, there are some Catholic distinctives about that doctrine, but the broader concept is shared by Protestants and evangelicals and Pentecostals alike, it seems to me. All the branches of the faith that I can think of at the moment share the idea that nature is not perfect, but it can be perfected, and it takes God's grace and not only human effort to perfect it, to improve it, to make it more like the kind of ultimate vision we have that we think God intended for it eventually. I see this as one of the creation itself as one of the first graces. It's God's gift. Grace has to do with the gift to humanity, and to give us the wherewithal to be, to have the ground of our being in the material sense is a gift to us for our lives, and that's the first grace. I see providence as the second grace. That has to do with what happens when we fail, when the sinful humans fall away from God and are distant from God, and plunged into the very matrix of history, which is problematic, warring, greedy, hostile, and vicious. Because that's the way lots of history is. If you don't believe it, you're not watching the television. Nevertheless, in the midst of this messy world, there are salvific elements that point to us toward the possibility of salvation, and that's what the biblical witnesses triggered in them, the expectation of the Messiah. And when you get that expectation of the Messiah, you're talking to the possibility of salvation, the third grace. Now, grace is all one in that they're all gifts of God, but they come in different phases of our understanding and different phases of our human history. The salvation history talks about the three stages: creation, fall, providential history, in which the prophets and the priests and the sages who wrote the wisdom literature and so forth all witness to us about the coming Messiah, and then the coming of the Messiah. So grace has three parts. It's not just one single act.
Now you mentioned the grace of creation, grace
Yes.
of providence, and what is the third grace?
Salvation.
Salvation. Now, in your estimation, did God plan for this chronological appearance of the grace periods, or did something go wrong and was God caught by surprise?
Well, I don't know the mind of God well enough to answer that fully.
Yes, but
Maybe even not hard, but I think that God always had an intention for salvation of humanity, but that He also gave humans freedom to make choices and to make errors, and that if you didn't have freedom, you wouldn't have humanity, and you wouldn't have us made in the image of God, and therefore He took the chance, and He can make it come out in the long run. That's a matter of faith,
right.
That seems to be gracious.
Now we're going to continue a conversation that we had. Just for background for those who are watching this, Professor Stackhouse was on my dissertation committee and pushed me quite deeply into discussing a part of my chapter I wasn't willing to write too much on, which was in the area of sin. Now, let's go back to that, Professor Stackhouse. My question then was, how much, as a theological ethicist, how much of what we call sin is also culpability, and how much of it is the effect of freedom?
Well, I think, are those contrary?
Well,
I
I'm
don't
asking the
think
question,
so.
yes, in the sense that if God has given us freedom, and freedom entails the possibility of rejecting God, then the exercise of freedom would be part and parcel of what it means to be made one of the high creations of God. Now, if that's the case, why does the church assign guilt to those who sin when sin is an expected form?
Well, because we take, not only is it as you say, but very often we try to justify this rejection of God, and that's the sin from which we're culpable. We lie to ourselves, we lie to our neighbors, and we lie to God about the nature of that. And then we're prideful about the fact that we didn't lie. So the lie and the
denial,
denial, and the pride that we exercise by denying it makes us appear to be like God.
Right.
And that displacement of God is the first idolatry.
Now, is there a possibility of an innocent sin, meaning a sin with no denial? The person actually believes that he's not sinful.
Well,
does that attract culpability?
It may, but one would have to ask whether he were really denying it or not. And sometimes, at least in my own life, I have to confess, sometimes I deny things that later I recognize I should not have denied. So that means, that goes back to your question about, is there a historical sequence in this?
Absolutely.
And I think that yes, there is a historical sequence, and we don't have that all charted out, but it does mean that we have to think in terms of a theology of history, not a thought thinking that occurs over time. God is the God of history as well as of creation, which has a structure to it that can't be ultimately violated.
Great. Andre, any comments on this?
If we look at theology from a historical point of view, we see doctrines, the ebb and flow and shifting. From a global perspective, how would you then respond to the very common social critique of religion that says that we have been responsible for many atrocities because of our theologies that have been ebbing and flowing, that have been created by our Christian ethos?
Well, one of the first responses of anyone who reads the theology of history is penitence. We get down on our knees and pray God for forgiveness for some of the things that have been done in the name of God by those of us and our predecessors who have done dastardly things in the name of the faith. And we do have to, that it's a kind of, being under God means a kind of regular exercise of humility. And not think that we're perfect. God may be perfect, but our theology of God may not be perfect. Our theology of history may not be perfect, and we have to constantly change. There's another reason for this historical reality, if I understand your question, and that is that whenever we develop theology, we develop it in terms of cultural concepts. We can't speak any language without being involved in the culture of that people that develop the language. And so we have had, over the centuries, we've had Greek theology, where the church was planted in what is now Greece, in the Greek Orthodox tradition, and became Eastern Orthodox. We had Roman Catholicism, we had German Lutheranism, we had Dutch Calvinism, we had English Puritanism, we got American Evangelicalism. And that suggests that the adjective of these cultural contexts are always present, and now we're finding the development of Sino-Christian theology, the development of Indo-Christian theology, the development of African Christian theology, and so forth. And these are continuing the development of doctrines. Now, depends on how you see doctrines. You can think of them in one of two ways. So one way is that these are blocks of truth that are spit out by the church in a particular period, and you keep that block sacred, and you build towers of truth out of these blocks, which are unassailable by any thought of criticism. I think that theory fails in historical consciousness. The other way is to see these as paving blocks along the path of the development of the faith. And we can appreciate the paving blocks of the past, even if they're flawed and cracked a little bit sometimes, and we can correct them later on. And the church has done this. Think about the history of the development of the doctrine of the Trinity, for example, as the way in which began with very simple Binitarian commission kind of confessions, and then it became Trinitarian, and then they had to figure out the relationship of the Holy Spirit to Christ and God, the Father, and that took more than 8 centuries for people to work out something like that. And there's some parts of our traditions that think we haven't got all that settled yet. Yes, I think we have to be humble, and we have to know the past, learn the past, see the flaws of the past, but also celebrate it because it brought us along the path and point us maybe a better constructive possibility for today and tomorrow.
Great, thank you. That was Professor Stackhouse. Welcome back and join us.